we're carrying on, as Steve said, we're looking at this series, looking at the attributes or the character of God, or what the Bible tells us about God. And we're looking at, as Steve said, Acts 17. Last week we looked at how it's easy to make God in our image, based on our weaknesses or our limitations or our experience. And we end up with a God that looks very like us, just perhaps a bit bigger and better, but essentially a bit like us. And we're doing this, as we say, looking at Acts 17, where Paul talks to loads of people that don't know God. And so we're going to work our way through that, what Paul says about God. But today, before looking at that, we're going to look at other things that can take God's place. So things that we put our trust in that's wrong. So the Bible calls these idols. And so we're going to be looking at idols today. So it's Acts 17, verse 16 to 21 we'll be looking at. I was in the supermarket just only a couple of weeks ago, and there was a little girl. She must have been about 2 years old, in a sort of a red party dress, that was obviously shopping with her dad, and when she looked up, she saw me and she looked terrified, so she turned around and she clung to this guy's trouser leg, but unfortunately it wasn't her dad, and she looked at, and her dad was on the other side in the same sort of pair of trousers, and she looked up and she looked at that classic look of sort of confusion and being terrified as she realized that this wasn't her dad. And we're looking at that today, really. This is about looking up and making sure that who we're clinging to, who we're trusting in, is actually God. We haven't got the wrong pair of trousers. So this is Acts 17, verse 16. It says, "Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. And so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, 'What does this babbler wish to say?' Others said, 'He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities,' because he was preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, 'May we know what this new teaching is about that you're presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean.' Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new." So we're going to I wanted to look today at essentially Paul's response to these idols, and then look at, I suppose, what are some of our idols in the time that we live? Because we don't walk around our towns and see idols like Paul would have seen then. And then how do we recognise idols or potential idols in our own lives? So this is a bit of background to the passage we're looking at. Paul's arrived in Athens, and I don't know if anyone here has ever had like a bad journey, but Paul's journey to Athens was a bad journey. I mean, he'd been imprisoned, he'd been beaten up, there were mobs of people trying to lynch him. He'd basically been chased from one town to the next town by a group of angry Jews, is what's essentially happened. And he eventually finds himself here in Athens. And the people that have dropped him there, his friends, leave him there. And he's just basically in this, I suppose, what was the sort of cultural capital at that point of the world. Athens was known for everything. So you had all these big people, Plato, Aristotle, all these big names that Paul would have heard about, all came from Athens. And you sort of, when I look at it, I sort of think, what would I have done? You turn up in this new amazing city that potentially he'd wished to go to for ages, and you could excuse him for sort of kicking back a bit and doing Athens, as it were, like going around and seeing the sights. But he doesn't. He walks around and he sees these idols, and something stirred up within him. He's provoked by what he sees. And he was so moved that he did something. He couldn't just leave it. He had to go and speak. And physical idols aren't such a thing for us in our culture, but they are still around the world in different countries. And China is one of those countries that still has a lot of idols, physical idols to see. This is, and many of you have heard of a guy called Hudson Taylor. He was a missionary in China in the sort of 1800s, and he had a daughter. His eldest daughter was called Grace, and she was born in 1859 in China. And she died in 1867 at the age of just 8 of meningitis, again in China. But at the age of 8, and the reason for mentioning this is Grace had this same passion that we see Paul having here. So shortly before she died, Hudson Taylor wanted to take Grace and his other children to a shaded tree near where they lived so that they could pray together. And he was holding her hand as they climbed a steep track that led to this tree. And as they were climbing the track, she noticed an old man carving an idol. And so she turned to him and she said, "Are you really making that so you can worship it instead of God?" This is an 8-year-old girl. And the guy, when he explained that, yes, that's what I'm doing, she turned to her dad and she said this, and she said, "Oh, Papa, that man doesn't know Jesus. He would never make an ugly idol like that if he knew Jesus. Do tell him about Jesus." And so Hudson Taylor did. He told this chap about Jesus, and it didn't seem to make any difference. The guy carried on making his idol. And as they carried on to this tree, she looked back and she could see him still making this idol. And when they reached the tree, they sung a hymn and they prayed together. And this is what Hudson Taylor wrote in his journal decades later about that moment. He said this, he said, "We sung a hymn, and then I said to Grace, 'Will you pray first?' And she did so, and never had I heard such a prayer. She'd seen the man making an idol, and her heart was full, and she was talking to God on his behalf. The dear child went on and on, pleading that God would have mercy on the poor Chinese and would strengthen her father to preach to them. I was never so moved by any prayer. My heart was bowed before God's. Words failed to describe it." So this was Grace, an 8-year-old girl that was moved like Paul was moved. And she was moved essentially because she knew Jesus, like Paul knew Jesus. So she tasted something better. And as Paul looked round Athens, he saw people that were made in God's image, that were worshipping things that they'd made. And they'd settling for things that weren't God, when God was close and near to them, and God was available to them. And provoked because the true God was being replaced by things that weren't God's. And provoked to make Jesus known. And I guess for us today, that's fine, but we don't have these physical idols, do we? We don't have these things that we can nest that in our culture here that we can point to and sort of identify as idols in our lives. But what I wanted to do was look at what are some of the idols in our time? What are some of the things that can take God's place in our lives? And then look at how can we identify those in our own lives? Because I think that's slightly harder than if we were all sat around with wooden idols, say, in our lounge. And I think it can be more subtle. I mean, there's some of the idols are the obvious ones, aren't they, that have been around, and most of these have been around forever, but things like money and power, sex, all those things that drive people, that people live for. And then there's some that aren't so obvious. And I just wrote a list here that I thought of, and I'm sure we could go around here and everyone could think of other idols. The idol of emotionalism. I don't know if anyone's ever thought of that. So that's where basically our feelings are placed as the most important thing in our lives. So we put the feelings, if you like, on the throne of our lives. And that's the most important indicator as to what's right or wrong. Or, that our feelings become our guidance system. We very rarely do things that go against how we feel. Idol of comfort. That's one of mine, I think. An idol of comfort. I suppose it's born out of a belief that our life should be comfortable. That when they're not, and we get upset, why isn't it comfortable? a bit, I suppose, like life's a bit of a, it should be more of a resort. We expect life to be a sort of a cruise ship where we're served, and when that doesn't happen, we get upset. Idol of success, that's another common one. So, like, we're bothered by our reputation and anything that might, I suppose we're terrified that our reputation can be destroyed and obsessed by what people think of us. And that leads, I suppose, to things like doubting God's word when we feel like we're following what God said and things don't seem to work out well for us. Why has this happened to me? And we doubt God's word because our main, the thing that's the most important to us is actually success or looking good or reputation. Covetousness is another one. Ephesians 5 describes that exactly as that, covetousness, which is idolatry. It says, so that's like just basically an excessive desire to have something we haven't got. It's covetousness. So, and I guess in our world with social media and everything, then that's quite a big one, isn't it? So we see, we look on social media and and it drives us to want something else. It drives us to think we need something else, to be like somebody else. And that fuels this. And there are loads of others. The list could go on. Food, I've made a list. Food, alcohol, family can become an idol. Church can become an idol. Even things like serving other people can become an idol. Anything that takes that central place from where Jesus should be. And I don't know if you're like me, you can look at lists like this and end up thinking, man alive, I think I've got all of those. I think all of those are idols in my life, you know? Maybe, but I think in terms of recognising idols in our lives, I think the key thing, as I thought about this, was when do our idols become massive issues? And they become massive issues when we are put under pressure, when it's a tough time. You know, when we're squeezed. There's a brilliant illustration with a water bottle. I can't remember who I saw doing it years ago, but he was on the stage, he just had a bottle of water. This hasn't got water in because it wouldn't be a good thing at home, but he had a bottle full of water, and he just started squeezing it and bending it and mucking it around. And then at the end of that, there's water just everywhere. And he's looking around saying, where did that water come from? And the answer obviously is the water came out of the bottle. That's true, but the ultimate answer is there's water on the floor because there was water in the bottle. And that's exactly what happens to us in tough times. So in tough times, our response, and we can sometimes think, wow, where did that come from? Well, where are those thoughts coming from? And they're coming because they're in us. They are the idols. And so you go through a tough time and suddenly you start saying things like, why can't I have any free time? Why have I got no free time? And suddenly that idol of yourself needing that comfort and that time starts coming out. Deuteronomy 8, this is what God says to the Israelites. He said, I took you through the wilderness for these 40 years to test you so that you'd see what was in your hearts. It spilled out in their tough times. Comfort, as I said, is an idol of mine, and I'm constantly aware of it creeping onto that throne. Things like when I find myself saying, I haven't had any time for myself for weeks. Can't I just have a break? All I want is some peace and quiet. I don't know if anyone's ever said that. All I need to do, I just need to get this done. Or yet, retirement. Oh, I can't wait for retirement. That's going to be so nice when I can retire. And I've got all these images of sitting back with my feet up in retirement. And I guess ultimately it ends with me saying, my life would be so much easier if I wasn't a Christian. Do you know, I don't know if anyone's ever had that thought come into your head. It just flicks in there. You know, oh, if I could just be like them. They don't have any of this bother. And suddenly this comfort thing has taken that whole central throne, that whole place where Jesus should be, and slowly crept in, and it's there. The Bible talks about idols being like obstacles in front of our face. You know, so it's like having that, like hands in front of our face, so that when you look around everywhere, that's all you really see. And everything's tainted by that. And we all know what we struggle most with. but that's one of mine. And the point of this today is not just to point out loads of idols and say, "Wow, what a nightmare it all is." That's not the point. The point of today, I suppose, with this is ultimately to say that Jesus has won this, like the things we have in our life and the things we see in other people's lives, where there are these idols and these things that in our lives where we creep to worship. It's not like this is an even battle. Like you've got Jesus and the idols and they're sort of clashing, trying who's going to win this fight. Jesus has won that fight. Jesus has beaten the idols. That's why he came. He came to free us so we don't have to serve other idols and we're free to serve him. Jesus has won this battle. That's the good news. And it's about us. It's about how we do that in our lives. And we do that not by trying to fight idols. We do that by putting Jesus, by looking and seeing Jesus and putting Jesus in that place. So I was recently reading a biography of it's a guy called Xi Zhengmo, who none of you will have ever heard of, I'm sure. He lived in China again in the 1800s, and he was a heroin addict or an opium addict back in those days, and this had ruined his life. His life was on a downward spiral, and everything was falling apart, and he'd tried everything to come off heroin and to get his life back on track, all the Western medicines and the Chinese medicines. And then a guy called David Hill, gave him a copy of the New Testament. David Hill was a guy that used to work alongside Hudson Taylor. And he read in there about Jesus, and he read in there about how the Holy Spirit could free him. And he became a Christian, and he was freed from this idol. He was released from this idol of heroin addiction. And he went on to be a missionary amongst the Chinese. And this was in 1877 that he became a Christian. So this was 10 years after Grace Hudson had said that prayer that God would free the Chinese people of their idols. Just 10 years after that. And it's a spiritual battle, isn't it, this? It's all a spiritual battle with our idols in our own lives and idols in the lives of the people that we see that are trapped. He became known, this character, as Pastor Shi. I think that's how you say it. It's spelled H-S-I, Pastor Shi. And many of you might have heard of him, that as his name. But initially, everyone in this village was real skeptical about this. They thought all these calamities were going to come on him because he'd rejected basically the gods of all the ancestral gods and the gods of his village. And they thought it was all been a disaster for him. But after a while, they couldn't deny this mad transformation that had happened in his life. He was free from heroin. Everything in his life was back in order. And so much so that eventually they said to him, when it came to the elections for the village elder, they proposed him for the village elder. And the village elder in those days is quite a big job. You look after all the taxes, you look after the temples, you look after the law and order. The whole lot falls on the village elder. And he said to them, "Look, I'll do it under two stipulations." And he said, the first one is, under no circumstances will I have anything to do with the sacrifices or the worship of idols or the festivals or the seasons that you have. I'll pray to the living God. I'll pray to the living God for the prosperity of the village. And they agreed to that. This whole village agreed to that. And then he said, the second is this: not only will I refrain from sacrifices to idols, but the whole village has to refrain, has to hold that same position. So if you'll close the temples completely and promise that no public worship of the gods will be held throughout this year, then and only then will I consent to being the elder. And they agreed to that. This is a few years after Grace Taylor prayed that prayer that China would be released from the idols, would be freed from the idols. And that village prospered like it had never prospered before, so much so that at the end of 1 year, he was re-elected. And that happened for 3 years running. So for 3 years, he was the elder of this village, and there was no temple worship and there was no idol worship, and the town prospered. And at the end of that, he was planting churches further and further afield. So he said, I can't do it again. But he finished by giving them these words. He said to them, by this time, the idols must be quite starved to death. spare yourselves now any efforts to revive them. And then it is how he left the village. But the point there is about, it's a spiritual battle for us all with these idols, and recognizing them in our lives and seeing them in each other's lives, just as Paul did, and being provoked by that is important. But it's a spiritual battle in that praying for that for others and praying for that for our friends, for freedom from idols, is a massive thing. I don't talk about it a lot, but it's a huge thing. Idols are a huge thing. Idols blind us to the living God. And that was what Paul was saying. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. You're created in the image of God. And as we'll see, it says God is close. He's not far from any of us. And our job, I suppose, as Paul's and as Grace Taylor's and as Pastor Shee's job, is to show people Jesus, is to not try and push the idols necessarily out of the way, but to say, here's Jesus. And in our own lives to do that. And whenever we struggle with anything, as I say, we all have many idols. Comfort's not my only idol. There's loads, but it's about not trying to push that. It's like you don't get rid of the darkness. That good illustrate. You don't get rid of the darkness by trying to shove the darkness out of a room. You get rid of the darkness by opening the curtains and letting the light in. And that's the same with idols in our lives. We don't get rid of them by just battling away at them. We get rid of them by seeing someone who is so much better, by seeing Jesus and putting him on the throne again of our lives. And that's essentially what we hope to do in the coming weeks and months, is to see God more clearly so that he stands more firmly in our vision. Essentially that we're not distracted by other idols, and that we can recognize them in our lives. So that's for today. I'll just finish in prayer and then hand back over to Steve. Heavenly Father, we want encounters, with your Son. Jesus, we want encounters with you that change and transform us, that we can, that we're provoked when we see idols, that we are zealous, that we are jealous for you, Jesus, in our own lives. And when we see other things creeping in, that you will stir us, that we're drawn back, and that we will be a people that provoke one another to that and spur one another on in that. Jesus, I thank you that you have overcome and freed us from living under other idols. You have freed us to be able to follow and serve you.